He lived in isolation for 5 years, until his late brother's pregnant Duchess arrived at his door. The house had been quiet for 5 years. Not the pleasant quiet of a summer evening, or the soft quiet that comes after a long day. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that fills a place when someone has decided, deliberately and completely, to shut the world out. Nathaniel Ashford was 41 years old, and he had not spoken to a single person outside of absolute necessity in more than half a decade. His home, Ravensmere House, sat on the edge of a wide loch in the Scottish Highlands. Stone walls. Tall windows. A long gravel path that curved through old oak trees before reaching the road. Beautiful, if you liked that sort of thing. Nathaniel had stopped noticing it. Every morning, he woke before the sun. He walked the boundary of the property, 3 miles, always the same route, never varying. He returned to the house, made his own coffee, and sat in the library until dark. He read. He did not write, though he had once been a published academic, a well-regarded one. His books still sold quietly in university shops. He did not think about them. People who had known him before, colleagues, friends, distant relatives, had tried to reach him in the early years. Letters arrived. He kept them in a box, unopened. Eventually, the letters stopped. People moved on. The world, as it always does, continued without him. He had one point of contact with the outside, Arthur Fenwick, his family's solicitor, a patient and precise man in Edinburgh who managed the estate accounts and forwarded only what was truly essential. Nathaniel had given him clear instructions. No visitors. No calls. Nothing that was not strictly legal or financial. There was also Mrs. Calloway, who came 3 times a week to tend the grounds and, in practice, to keep the house from falling into ruin. She was a compact, practical woman in her 60s who had known the Ashford family for 30 years and had a gift for silence that Nathaniel genuinely respected. She did not ask him questions. She did not look at him with pity. She fixed what was broken and left him alone, and for this he was quietly grateful. The reason for all of it, the silence, the closed rooms, the 5 years of chosen darkness, was Edmund. Edmund Ashford had been Nathaniel's younger brother. 36 years old when he died, 3 weeks before Christmas, of a sudden illness that moved faster than anyone expected. He had been misdiagnosed at first. By the time the doctors understood what they were dealing with, Edmund had 24 hours left. Nathaniel had been on a train to London when he got the call. He arrived at the hospital in time to sit beside his brother for the last 2 hours, which was both a mercy and, in the years that followed, a source of a particular kind of pain that he could not name or put down. The guilt was not rational. He knew this. He had been on a train, he could not have known, could not have prevented it. But guilt rarely listens to reason, and Nathaniel's guilt had one specific shape. He had been supposed to travel with Edmund the week before, when Edmund first mentioned not feeling well. He had cancelled. A professional matter, he had told himself. But underneath that, if he was honest, and in 5 years of silence he had become very honest, there had been something smaller and less flattering. Edmund had just been given a prestigious academic appointment, and Nathaniel had felt the edge of something that shamed him now. He had not wanted to celebrate. He had never said this to anyone. He carried it the way you carry something sharp in a closed fist, carefully, always, and at great cost. The letter from Arthur Fenwick arrived on a Tuesday in November. Nathaniel left it on the hall table for 3 days, as was his habit. On Friday morning, he opened it with his coffee still in hand, expecting something routine, a form to sign, a tax matter, something dull and administrative. It was not dull. The letter explained, in Arthur's careful measured language, that Edmund's widow, Isadora Ashford, née Voss, was in a position of some difficulty. She was 7 months along in a pregnancy she had not known about until a month after Edmund's funeral. Her own family, based in Vienna, had offered limited support. Edmund's estate was still being settled, and the legal process was slower than expected. Most significantly, Edmund's will, written 2 years before his death and never updated, named Nathaniel as the legal guardian of any children Edmund might have. Edmund had named him. He had thought about this, at some point, and written it down, and signed his name to it. Nathaniel read the letter twice. Then he walked to the fireplace and held it over the flame until it caught. He watched it burn to nothing. Then he walked to the door of the East Wing guest room, which had been closed for years, and pushed it open. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The room was cold and smelled of disuse. He found Mrs. Calloway in the garden. "The East Wing room will need to be prepared," he said. "Someone is coming next Friday." She looked at him for a moment without expression, then nodded once and went to find her cleaning supplies. She did not ask who. He did not explain. He went back to the library and sat down. He did not read. Isadora arrived on a Friday evening, in heavy rain, in a taxi from Inverness station. She did not wait for anyone to help her. She paid the driver, lifted her own suitcase, carried it up the gravel path, and knocked on the door. Nathaniel opened it. They looked at each other. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said clearly what he had expected. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back simply, and the kind of composed expression that takes effort to maintain, the expression of someone who has been practicing steadiness for a long time and has become very good at it. She wore a gray coat. She was visibly, unmistakably, very pregnant. "Mr. Ashford," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear, with a trace of Austrian accent. "Come in," he said. He took her suitcase. Mrs. Calloway, who had stayed late without being asked, appeared from the kitchen and made the actual introductions, warm ones, with tea offered and the location of the bathroom explained and a kind word about the room being freshly aired. Nathaniel set the suitcase by the bedroom door and then retreated to the library. By the time Isadora ate the meal Mrs. Calloway had left on the stove, she was entirely alone in the East Wing. She did not complain. She did not cry. She unpacked her smaller bag and took out a journal, Edmund's journal, given to her by Arthur Fenwick with the rest of Edmund's effects. She sat on the edge of the bed, opened it, and read until she was too tired to continue. Then she turned off the light. The first 2 weeks were governed by distance. Nathaniel produced a handwritten page the following morning, one page, set on the kitchen table, outlining the household arrangements. Meals at specific times. His study was private. The car was available for medical appointments. He would arrange transport in advance if she gave him notice. Isadora read it without comment. Then she asked a single question. "Is there somewhere I can play music?" He had not expected this. He looked at her for a moment, then turned without speaking and led her down the hall to the drawing room, which had not been used in years. A piano stood against the far wall under a pale dust sheet. He pulled the sheet off in one motion, folded it over his arm, and left the room. That night, Isadora played Schubert. The sound moved through the walls of the old stone house, soft, unhurried, moving through the library where Nathaniel sat with an open book he was not reading. He did not move for a long time. He told himself it was simply noise. He told himself it did not affect him. But he sat there until the music stopped, and when it did, the silence that followed felt different from the silence he had lived in for 5 years. Heavier somehow. More present. For weeks there was a real disagreement, the first and, in some ways, the last. Nathaniel came home from his morning walk to find a woman he did not know sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her, laughing with Isadora about something. Mrs. Calloway was at the counter, perfectly at ease. The stranger was Dr. Priya Menon, the village doctor who handled Isadora's prenatal care, invited, on this occasion, not for any medical reason but simply for company. Nathaniel stopped in the doorway. Something in his face shifted, not anger, exactly, but distress, the distress of a man whose careful arrangements have been altered without warning. He was polite. He greeted the doctor briefly. And then he went to his study and did not come out for the rest of the day. That evening, a folded piece of paper appeared under the library door. Isadora had written, "I am sorry. I should have told you first. I am still learning how this house works. That is not an excuse. I will ask in the future." Nathaniel picked it up. He read it several times. He did not write back. But he did not throw it away either. He placed it in the drawer of his desk, where it remained for many years after. 6 weeks after Isadora arrived, Arthur Fenwick drove up from Edinburgh with a sealed envelope. It was addressed to Nathaniel in Edmund's handwriting. Arthur had been holding it for 3 years, under instructions to deliver it in person when the time seemed right. "Edmund asked me to use my judgment," Arthur said, in his quiet way. I believe this is the right time. Nathaniel took the letter into the library alone. He sat for a long while before he opened it. Edmund had written it 2 months before he died, during a period when he had been quietly concerned about a separate health matter, less serious, that he had not mentioned to the family. He had not known about the meningitis. No one had. But he had been thinking about things, as people do when their own health makes them think more carefully. He had been thinking about Nathaniel. The letter did not say what Nathaniel had perhaps feared, it did not contain accusations, or old grievances. Edmund had never been that kind of person. What it said instead was simpler, and in some ways harder to receive. Edmund wrote that he had never blamed Nathaniel for anything. He wrote that the distance between them in those final years had grieved him, but that he understood it better, perhaps, than Nathaniel understood it himself. He wrote that Nathaniel had always carried more than his share of everything, for as long as Edmund could remember, and that this had never been required. And then Edmund wrote, "You were never owed the weight you gave yourself. Set it down. Carry something lighter instead, carry my child, if you will. That is not a burden. That is a beginning." Nathaniel sat in the library for a very long time. Outside, the early evening light moved across the loch and turned the water gold, and then gray, and then dark. Something shifted after the letter, not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way a stone shifts in a riverbed. Slowly. Noticeably, if you were paying attention. Nathaniel began to appear at breakfast more often. He was present in the kitchen on mornings when he had previously been on his walk before Isadora rose. He did not say much. But he was there. He refilled the coffee. He checked once, without being asked, whether the East Wing room was warm enough. He began driving Isadora to her medical appointments himself, rather than arranging the car service he had initially offered. The drives to and from the village clinic in Inverness took over an hour each way. For the first several trips, the conversation was minimal: directions, timing, the occasional remark about the road conditions. Then, one afternoon in December, on the way back from a routine check with Dr. Menon, Isadora asked, "What was Edmund like when he was small?" Nathaniel was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he began to speak. He talked for almost the entire drive home. He talked about the summer Edmund was 7 and built a raft from fallen branches and tried to sail it across the loch, which was far wider than Edmund had considered. He talked about the way Edmund laughed before the punchline of any joke he tried to tell, he never could hold the comedy together. He talked about the phone call from Vienna, at 2 in the morning, when Edmund had just discovered a poem he loved and had to read it to someone immediately, and Nathaniel had been that someone, half asleep and then, by the end of the poem, not asleep at all. When he finished, there was a moment of quiet. Then Isadora said, "He was exactly like that. He once called me from a conference in Madrid to tell me about a painting he had just seen. He was standing in the gallery. He described it for 20 minutes. Nathaniel almost smiled. It was brief, and he looked back at the road immediately, but Isadora saw it. She looked out the window at the passing trees and said nothing more. But something in her posture changed, a fraction of the careful distance she maintained had eased. The baby came 3 weeks early, on a January night when the roads to Inverness were closed by ice and heavy snow. The storm had been forecast, but its arrival was faster and more complete than the weather service had predicted. At 3:15 in the morning, Isadora knocked on the library door, where Nathaniel had fallen asleep in his chair. She was calm. She told him what was happening. He was immediately awake. Mrs. Calloway, reached by phone, arrived within 15 minutes, having driven slowly through the snow in her old Land Rover without being asked. Dr. Menon, reached by phone from the village, stayed on the call and guided them through what needed to be done. The next 2 hours were not easy. They were frightening and exhausting, and required everyone to be better than they thought they could be under the circumstances. But Mrs. Calloway had steady hands and a calm manner that came from long experience with difficult situations. And Nathaniel, who had not, in 5 years, been required to be present for anything, was present for all of it. He did not flinch. He did not leave the room. The baby arrived at 5:22 in the morning. A girl. Small, and very much alive, and expressing her opinion about the situation loudly and at length. Isadora's hands were shaking too much to hold her securely in the first moments. Mrs. Calloway was occupied with what needed to be done medically. Nathaniel stepped forward and took the child. He held her. He stood very still, in the gray winter light coming through the east wing window, and held his brother's daughter. She was very small. She had Edmund's coloring, the dark hair, the particular set of the jaw. She had stopped crying, briefly, and was looking at him with the unfocused, serious gaze of the very newly born. After a few minutes, Isadora was ready, and Nathaniel placed the baby in her arms. He walked quietly out of the room and into the corridor. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and stayed there for a long time. When Mrs. Calloway found him there an hour later, she looked at him for a moment and asked simply if he was all right. "I turned the photograph over," he said. She understood. In his library, on his desk, a framed photograph of Edmund had sat face down for 2 years. Mrs. Calloway had never moved it, never commented on it. She understood now that he had. She patted his shoulder once, in a matter-of-fact way, and went back to make tea. The child was named Cecily. Cecily Edmund Ashford, the middle name chosen by Isadora, and not discussed with Nathaniel beforehand. When he heard it, he said nothing. But he stood a little straighter. In the weeks that followed, the house changed in ways that were quiet but unmistakable. Nathaniel opened rooms that had been closed for years, first for practical reasons, then less practically. He contacted a building firm about repairing the stonework on the east wall. He wrote a letter to a former colleague, the first professional correspondence he had initiated in 5 years. The letter was brief and a little stiff, but it was sent. Isadora noticed all of this. She was a perceptive woman, and she had spent enough time watching Nathaniel closely enough to understand what these changes meant. She did not comment on them. She did not make them into anything larger than they were. She had her own decisions to consider. She had spoken to Arthur Fenwick about a flat in Edinburgh, a practical plan, a reasonable one, the kind of future she could build on her own terms. The plan still existed. She had not cancelled it. But she had also stopped counting the days until she might leave. One evening, when Cecily was 3 weeks old and had fallen asleep in the warmth of the drawing room, Isadora sat at the piano and played, quietly, careful not to wake the baby. She played something slow and gentle, a piece she had known since childhood. After a few minutes, she heard the drawing room door open behind her. Nathaniel came in. He sat in the chair closest to the fire, the one he had never used, in all the weeks she had played. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He looked at the fire, and he stayed. She did not stop playing. She did not say anything either. There was nothing that needed to be said, not then. The music moved through the old stone room, and the fire burned steadily, and outside the Highland winter pressed quietly against the windows, and inside the house was warm. This is where things stood, not at an ending, but at a beginning. A man who had spent 5 years learning how to be absent was learning, slowly and without any guarantee, how to be present. A woman who had carried grief and pregnancy and uncertainty across half a country had found, against all expectation, a place where she was not entirely alone. And in a room upstairs, a small girl slept, new to the world, knowing nothing of what had come before her, and entirely unaware that her very existence had unlocked something in a house that had been locked for a very long time. The photograph of Edmund sat face up on the desk in the library. The closed rooms were opening, one by one. Outside, the lock lay still and wide in the winter dark, and somewhere in the bare oak trees, the first suggestion of something other than cold was beginning, very faintly, very slowly, the way all real things begin.